This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn and I are thrilled to have Dee Liebhart back with us. Dee is a nurse and writer. She writes and sometimes lives stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, where they learn that life is rarely predictable and answers to life's most complex questions are almost never black and white. House on Fire, her first novel, won the 2023 Page Turner Award for both fiction and debut. It was longlisted for the 2022 Petrichor Prize and received an honorable mention from Writer's Digest. Her essay, Thalassophobia, a true account of very out-of-the-ordinary honeymoon, won the 2021 Linda Julian Creative Nonfiction Prize from Emory's Journal and is available on her website. So welcome back, Dee.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to talk revision. And Kathryn, you said you're excited. So I'm going to can't throw the ball to you. Start us off.
I feel like whenever we talk about revision, it's so like few and far between because it's like you wrote the story, now fix it is kind of the short end of it, but there is so much that you can struggle with in revision. So when you wrote that, you were like, how to get through revision and the struggles of revising forever versus not. I was like, yes, this is what I need to hear. I'm so ready. I'm here for it.
I don't know that I'm the right person to give advice, though.
No, it's good. It's just having the conversation where you talk about it. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So tell us something about your revision journey. What made you bring this topic to us?
Oh my gosh. So it's funny because I just launched a literary magazine, and I am taking submissions for flash fiction, and we're getting the gamut of folks who've done very little revision, to stories that are what you would expect to get, and it just kind of brought back that whole concept of like you start out as a writer, you're trying to get this idea out. You've got that spark of creativity and you want to do something. And that's like just the easiest part of it. That's the sad, that's just the flash. That's nothing, and revision, revision is the story. Revision is how you make something worth reading. And so I think that for me, I no joke, I revised a novel for 10 years. Now it wasn't just, I was not doing other things. On my website, my about page is a very jokey sort of like biography of my whole life of writing. And, I moved countries. I went back to school. I had a kid. I did a lot of things in that 10 years, but I was playing with that book for on and on and on, like seeking perfection, to the degree that I joined a writing group with the explicit intent, of we were going to do that. We were all reading our novels, and I joined it with the intent of asking people, should I stop or should I continue with this book? And everyone after reading it said, you should continue. It's good. And then I said, I got to throw it away because I can't stand it anymore. And so I had worked it to death. Like I had worked it so long and so hard. And then I was so removed from where I started. So I lived in Japan when I started the novel. It was set in Japan. And then now I'm here realizing it 10 years later. I no longer live in Japan. I have a different life. I'm trying to remember, the way a street corner looked or something. I was like, I don't even know where this is anymore. And so I'm very much that, person who could revise to death. And so that was what I was talking about when we were talking about last time. I'm very, very deliberately went to a class with someone with meaningful feedback almost immediately, because I realized when I finally took that other book to revision and other human beings reading it, for those 10 years, no one read it. I was like, wait, this is what I needed. This is what I needed a long time ago. And so I think that like I have that, it's almost like the polar opposite. I did, and I
Yeah.
deliberately did it. I forced myself to do it. So instead of a 10-year process, I was in a 4-year, I think I wrote that book for 4 years.
Okay. Yeah. So first big takeaway, Kathryn, don't write in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. I have a writing group right now and I'm drafting and getting feedback, and it is just like the best thing. And I, knowing myself as a writer, I'm not the kind of person that will sit in the first act forever. So it's okay for me to go back and revise the first act a couple of times before I move on, because I will move on. But it's like having that instantaneous feedback where I'm still in that creativity zone where I feel like, okay, like I can see how this would make it better immediately, and then being able to make those changes. It's so beneficial because you do echo chamber. It's a real thing.
Yeah, it is. One of my coaching group writers last season said she was surprised how beneficial it was having ongoing feedback in the coaching group instead of writing it, submitting the manuscript, getting editorial comments, writing it, but being in a group where she could ask questions as she went, get feedback, bounce ideas around off of people, submit pages, get comments, and having that ongoing process. And I think, just saying that, we're all like, yes, get feedback as you go. At the same time, though, what's popping to mind is for some writers, there's a danger then of spinning the wheels because you've got too many cooks in the kitchen, or you get confused about, is this really consensus? Is this just somebody with a strong voice versus what my story needs, kind of a thing?
Ooh, I have something really interesting to say about that.
Oh, please do. Awesome.
Or not, I'd like probably built that up too much. Now you'd be like, that wasn't that interesting. I actually dropped out of my writing group during the writing of the next book. And they had really helped me with House on Fire. They were fabulous for House on Fire. When I went to them with House on Fire, it was much more finished and polished. And so I was reaching out with the new book, asking for feedback much earlier. And what happened is I started getting that mixed message. Like I know how I can write a story. Like I know I can plot a story, and I can do that. So I have a lot of confidence in that quality of my writing. And so people would start going off on these kind of little tangents, and I was like, this is not helpful. Like this is not good feedback. And so I think that one thing I think we should all endeavor to do is be better. What a friend of mine who he's in that writing group, and he and I can remain in touch, and we give each other feedback, but we both are very focused on what we call actionable feedback. So not like, oh, I don't like that character. It's like, well, what is it that you want this, what actionable thing can the writer do to make that character better? Or what is it that you're actually getting to? And I definitely think that's something that some writing groups don't have that concept. Because it started being so negative. And what I realized after a while, and I alluded to the topic of the book in the last one, was like, oh, this is about the book. This is about the topic. It is not about the writing. It's like, you don't like this topic and this mom, and you want her to do exactly what I'm asking her to do in the story, but you want it to happen in the beginning, and then there wouldn't be a story. Like, so it's like they want this to be over. They don't want to go through the pain of this mom dealing with her teenage son who's a white supremacist. They don't want to do that. And so I was like, oh, you guys can't, you're not the right writing group for this. So I ended up working with a developmental editor.
Nice.
Instead, because I felt like that was what I needed. I needed somebody who was looking. The other thing I don't like about some writing groups is when you do pages. If you're writing a novel, if you're writing a short story, that's absolutely brilliant. But if you're writing a novel and people are reading it in pieces, that may or may not be the most effective way to get feedback. Because you don't know where it's going.
Absolutely.
And so you don't know how to people tell you something and you're like, yeah, but in the next chapter, this is what happens, so
Yeah.
they have to see the whole thing before they can come back and be like, okay,
Mhm.
this is what I was desiring.
Yes.
Right. Right. I love that you dropped out of your writing group because you weren't getting the kind of feedback that was beneficial to you.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody out there needs to remind themselves it's okay and you can do that. Like, it doesn't mean, they're still good people, they're still good writers, they're still helpful, they're still right. But there is that time and place. And I think too, it illustrates what can be the difference between a writing group, a critique group of peers versus group coaching, where you've got somebody who's the facilitator, the moderator, who's, just got a finger on the pulse of everything that's happening and can guide things and make sure it's productive and constructive, and that the writer whose work is being looked at is being helped instead of people trying to fix things,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
I love that you do that you have that, because I think every writing group would benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
Having some person whose job it is to keep it all kind of, intact. Because the other thing that I do is I write unlikable characters. I write people who are real.
Right.
And so I fortunately, my writing group was a lot of women, and there was a gentleman in our group who's actually a fairly well-known nonfiction writer, and he just couldn't take my non-likable women, and he made the grave mistake of saying, well, she's not very likable, and like all the women in this group were like, women don't have to be likable, and it was like this huge thing, and he was like, all right, I get it.
Oh gosh.
But it was
funny.
really interesting because, like, in that regard, my group was really, defending like my right to write these like sort of unlikable women. And so that was great. But just overall, yeah, just feeling like I wasn't getting what I needed out of it and couldn't get enough out of it. And then also for me being someone who works full time, I was like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time to spend with you guys reading your stuff, giving you feedback. That's great. I love it, but I can't do all of this and then have to go find my feedback elsewhere. It's like I'm here for a purpose.
Right.
So that's that. Yeah, it was a good choice, and I haven't yet gone back. So, but I remember, they're still my friends, and I remain in touch with them.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's great. Right. I'm going to hand it back to Kathryn because I want us to go back to the revision process and get a little more nuts and bolts on revision craft. So, Kathryn, throw us a question or a topic or some struggle.
Oh, geez.
I'm letting you.
You always
do this
to me.
Always.
They throw it at me, and I'm like,
I can take it back if you don't want it.
No, it's okay.
I edit out.
No, I will accept your challenge.
Excellent.
And figure something out on the fly. No, I sitting with something for a long time, getting that feedback, having that momentum piece that you were talking about. Like, how important is it to you to have that like creative momentum, or do you let things sit, or do you just try to continue to track forward and make that progress?
So I have a couple things that I do that I think are like, I don't know, they're not unique, but like they're like very particular. They're my, I definitely do this. I don't go back. I always go straight through the entire thing when I'm revising. I do the same thing when I write. I'm a super fast first drafter. Like I can do that like really, really fast. And then, I can spend years revising. The limit so far is 10. We'll see if I can do that. But so I always go front to the end when I'm revising. And then like in the new book that has 4 different storylines, then I actually did a revision process where I only read one character's story. I did all 4 characters where I read their story all the way through. And is this consistent with itself, and does it make sense to itself? So that's, I think, one of my big things that I always am going straight through. So I don't know if that's quite what you're meaning with momentum, but that's what I do. I don't go backwards ever. And I think the other thing that I do that when I write, and I do that when I revise. I do definitely take little breaks, like, so I'll let something sit for a bit. So the first, like, I'll write the first draft of something, and then I'll probably let it sit for a little while, a month or two or something like that. And I would say more often that's just like life that happens. It's like I'm not in the active part of writing it. So if I'm not revising it, what am I doing? So I'm not doing it, and I'll kind of focus on something else. So I think that, yeah, I'm definitely not somebody who waits for motivation, though. I'm not somebody who writes every day. That would be virtually impossible. But I absolutely, if I have a writing schedule, when I'm writing a draft, I have a word count, and no matter what, I will meet that word count, even if I'm like, these last 200 words are garbage, but they will be there tomorrow. They will be done. I don't believe in time limits because I can sit in a chair for hours and not do anything. So I always have a word count. So those, I guess those kind of things, but then I have like I have a goal. Like I tend to work 4 days on and 3 days off. And so I'll say like, okay, I'm going to write, I'd say about 3,000 words a day is my goal. Because I can do a little bit more. I can do 2,500 is like no problem at all. So I always kind of try to push it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So it's got 3,000 words of revision, like you've got 3,000 words of
3,000
manuscript and you're revising it?
manuscript. With revision, I set goals that I never meet. So I think they would be unrealistic, probably unrealistic goals. So I was like, I will get through this chapter today, and then I'm still on the first two paragraphs. So that's a little harder for me. I do have a tendency to just, I can literally just go over the same paragraph over and over and over again. And at some point, like, just, you got to stop, got to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think also having deadlines that are, when you're not working, you're not working necessarily with like a big publishing company that's like, you have to have this done by such and such a day. It's a little bit, you're like, oh, I'm going to push that out a little bit. Oh, I'm going to push that out a little bit. So that can be a negative, when you're working, like maybe when you're not at the process that you have a deadline, or you're, independently published and you're arbitrarily making those deadlines. So I do love deadlines. So I do stuff, but yeah, it can be tough. And I think, I love language, right? So I love playing with language until it just, you're like, oh, that's it. That's definitely it. And then the scary part is you come back tomorrow and you go, that's not it. That's definitely not it. But I try to move on when I've had those moments of like, oh, that's it. That's definitely it.
Yeah. Yeah. So Kathryn, do you have a process you favor for revision, like doing a full pass or doing a chapter and just looking at one character, or just looking at the, arc of the plot and the segment, and doing sweeps that way? Like, if you experimented with these different methods?
I have. Yeah, I tend to find that if I am looking at the whole, it's too much and I get overwhelmed and I freeze. So I can't say I'm revising the book. Like, it's done and now I'm going to start revision. So I tend to try and like re-outline and then take it in pieces. Like, I'm going to look at this part, or I'm going to look at the arc of this or the arc of that, because there are so many like little things that you can kind of focus on. And I like to be linear and go from start to finish, but there are times where I have to loop around or go back and do this one thing first because I can't get the foreshadowing right, or I can't get the subtext right unless I go finish that. But I feel like this has been such a process of years of figuring out, like, for myself, I have to bite size it, or else I'm just going to sit there and stare at it. Like, I don't want to write these 80,000 words again.
Yeah.
And the reality is I will, but if I focus on it in small bits, it doesn't feel like I've rewritten a book. It's more like, again, I've fixed what was already there on the page.
Are you a plotter? Do you like plotting stuff?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that was actually, like, when you were talking about your writing group, that was something that my writing group is very small, but two, we're all writing novels and having that just pages isn't going to work. So the first thing we did is we all came with our outlines. So everybody's got the whole book in front of them to some extent, and then they get the chapters. And so you can see how it fits within the whole, because otherwise it doesn't work. You're right. So yeah.
And then you said, you felt like that overwhelming, like kind of 80,000 words thing. So, because I feel like it's a totally different thing. Like, it's like, I don't have that sense of like, oh my gosh, I'm writing this whole thing again. It's like, I'm like, now I'm making it readable. Like, and so it's like, to me, it feels like a very different process. It's almost like a very different part of my brain that I'm using than when I'm like getting that draft out. It is just like go, 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 go.
Yeah. And my first drafts tend to be really fast, and I underwrite. And then a lot of times in the past, I've approached it where I'll read a chapter and then I basically just rewrite it. And so then I feel like I'm just going backwards and not actually making forward progress, because I still have to fix these words that I now just rewrote. Yeah. So that's where I've been kind of learning about myself and about my procrastination, about my frustrations, and about my overwhelm points and how to fix that,
What if on your second pass, so you do the first draft and underwrite and get it done fast, and then on the second pass, what if you did chapter 1 until you were satisfied with it? Like,
oh, that's terrifying.
All that remains is the polishing before publishing, right? And then you do chapter 2, but then you don't have to think, okay, I'm moving forward, but I know I'm going to have to go back.
True.
You think I'm moving forward and what's behind me is done.
I tend to get to a point where I am very satisfied with the way that the story is going before I move on. And that's what happened with like my first couple chapters in the book I'm working on right now. It's like the first act, for lack of a better term, right? And I wrote it, and then I got feedback, and I was like, yeah, I need to rearrange this. And I rearranged it, and I got to a point where I'm like, this is good. Like stone, plot, points in, done. But I know I'll go back and do a draft or, an edit and a revision, maybe even some minorly major things, if that makes sense, but nothing that would alter the sequence of events.
Right. Ever wish you had a developmental editor on speed dial? How about the next best thing? Join me in the Writer's Circle, a free office hour where you can ask questions and get answers. The schedule is posted at wordessential.com/events.
Right. So is that kind of what you were talking about? Like getting it to the point where it's like,
yeah,
I don't have to go back. I don't have to fix this. This is done. Yeah.
Yeah. And some writers do need every word to be perfect. They need the chapter to be perfect before they do the next chapter. One of my mentors in my MFA program told me she has to have every word perfect. The chapter has to be completely done before she can write the next one.
Every writer is different, right?
Yeah.
It's discovery, which is crazy.
Yes.
Because it's art, but it's also
satisfied. Yeah. And then the remaining pass is going to be the polishing and the fine tuning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you were talking about like when you said something about going back and fixing pieces, I was like, oh yeah, it's you definitely like if you change something, I was like, okay, how many times did I say something that impacts this, and then you have to go back and find it and rework it so this next thing makes sense. And that's actually one of my favorite things about revising, and especially when somebody reads something, is if they respond to something and they say, oh, this didn't work here. Often what you're fixing is not that. It's everything that came before that, that moment didn't make sense, or that moment didn't what you thought it was going to do. It's like, it's everything before that built up to that needs to be fixed. It's not that thing, So yeah, you are, I guess in that regard, I do go backwards sometimes from wherever I'm at to fix those pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm on like a secondary feedback loop right now on that first act. And I feel like the feedback I got back again was things that I could go in and change a paragraph or change, a few key things and not have to, like I said, not have to rewrite the whole thing. Or and like you're saying, like you can say it's everything beforehand, or you might just have to flip what happened just a little bit to make it make that much more sense. Which I feel like that's so much progress. Like it just makes my heart go, oh yes.
Yes,
Like
exactly.
you're accomplishing something.
But it's interesting because I have in the new book that I would say, like, I thought I like I said, I worked with a developmental editor who I really, was great. And I had revised it a couple times. I think I don't even know how many times now. But then I had some people read it, kind of my early readers. And I had one early reader, and she's fabulous in that she's like more meticulous than anybody I know, so it's like, she's like giving me like, feedback about like stuff that everybody else missed, like this word was spelled wrong. How did everybody else miss that? Um, so she's great in that regard, but then she gave me some feedback, and I was like, do I believe this feedback? Like and it's not that I don't believe her, right? That was her experience, but do I, as the writer, feel like this is meaningful feedback that I have to do something with? And I think that's a real dilemma as an inexperienced writer. And I'm not, that experienced of a writer, but I at some point, you as the writer are the person who decides what to do with that feedback. And I think that um, definitely, I think what I try to tell people with, when you're learning to take feedback, it's like it's not anything, it's information. And you as the writer look at that information and say, is this information applicable to my vision of this story and how I want to go forward with this? Does it help me make this story something? Um, and at the same time, as an inexperienced writer, sometimes it's your ego talking, not your writer, right? It's the ego of like, how come you didn't get my story? And you're like, because it didn't make any sense. That's why. And that having to be able to tell the difference between that's really hard. Because on the one hand, you have to put yourself out there and be vulnerable. So of course your ego is like, protect me, protect me, protect me. And then at the same time, I need those people to tell me, stuff and hear something. And I definitely had that with the new book, someone giving me some feedback. There's a character, they're like, well, she just pops up at the end. And I was like, no, she doesn't. She does not just pop up at the end. I was like, she's in the first chapter, she's in like this chapter. And I was like, how do you feel? But that was her experience, right? So I was like, okay, I need to go back and figure out why that character is just disappearing from the page in the beginning, that they're just zooming by. And maybe there's so much happening there that it's just it seems incidental, but it's not. And so it needs to be brought forward. So it's like, yeah, you're always judging. And then there's part of me that's like, maybe you need to read more carefully. Like, and maybe it's fine, so that I think it's very hard to know when something's done, when it's when you've gotten to the degree that you're going to get to. And at some point, unless you don't want published books, you have to stop. You have to stop and say, this is done, and it's as done as it's going to be. And this is the book that is going to exist.
Lots of nodding, silent nodding here.
Yeah. Good advice. Exactly.
Perfection is not possible.
No.
Right? Perfection is not possible.
No. And the book will go out with mistakes. Like just live with that. There will be mistakes. So what is your biggest challenge or frustration with the revision process? And I'll ask both of you this question.
I don't know that it's required, that you aren't really writing a story. I mean, it would be so beautiful. I'm a huge fan of Natalie Goldberg, Writing Down the Bones and Wild Mind. And those were like very formative for me when I was probably in my 20s. Like that's not like long ago they came out. I think I was in my late 20s when they came out. And that is a huge piece of the creative process. And yet it is not at all a finished anything. And so I think once you accept that revision is really where the story gets made, you understand how vital that is. But it's still like a terrible I would just love to be able to like write down that first draft and go, oh, look at that. It's beautiful. So I think that's probably just the biggest challenge, that like knowing that all of that work is necessary and that it's required and that it is arbitrary to a certain degree where I stop that process. Like I won't know if this is a good book until a bunch of other people are reading it.
Mm-hmm.
I can have a sense of that. I can have a sense. I think my greatest fear, like with this new book, is it's dark, and it shows it shows that other side of people that I think that we like to like pretend doesn't exist. And like I said on the last show that we were doing, it's about a mother who finds out that her son is a white supremacist. And he's a teenager and going through that. And a big informing thing for me was reading Sue Klebold. I couldn't remember the last one. Sue
Uh-huh.
Klebold's memoir of her son, who was one of the Columbine shooters, and the weight of blame that came to her as a parent. How could you not have known this about your son? How could you not have seen this? And the whole purpose of her memoir is basically to answer that question, is because it wasn't there, because that person
Yeah.
was not shown to me. This is how I missed it. And if you think you are not capable of missing it, then that this is what the purpose of this book is. And to read the reviews of that book and the kinds of things that people would say about her, that's the mom that's in my book, right? Is this mom that everybody's going to want to blame, and to show
Mm-hmm.
you how they get there. That's a really hard thing to do, to show the human side of somebody who's desperately flawed, but is not responsible for the actions that someone else takes, and does not create those actions in another human being. And so it's like I think that, and I feel like I'm way off on some other tangent here right now. Um, but
Well,
being fearful that that darkness and that thing that I'm trying to achieve, that people are not going to understand,
mm-hmm.
and not see that, and not see that I'm trying to deal with a human being with compassion, and trying to show that side, that they're just going to have this reactionary view. And like, how do you parse that out when you're having people read that as part of your revision and your writing process? It's like, are you responding to the thing that I'm actually trying to do
Mm-hmm.
here? Are you responding to the writing? Like, you're like, oh, the writing's bad. The writing, no, the writing is not what you're responding to. You're responding to the story. So yeah, I do think I went off on a little bit of a tangent there.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I think it brings up again the point that we really need to trust our guts and our inner compass. There's that issue of the ego getting in the way when we're getting feedback, but then there's its counterpart, the other issue of readers not addressing the work because they're addressing something else, like an issue in society they don't want to confront, or their own fear or whatever. And then we need to be able to look at the feedback, look at ourselves, and look at the work and say, where do I sit in all of this? Is my ego getting in the way of me receiving feedback and making art? Or is this person's ego getting in the way of them addressing what's on the page? When I look at the work, where is the theme coming forward and those issues and questions I'm delving into? And is it sufficiently on the page to raise those questions in the reader's mind versus a plot point that might be sensational if you don't have it with that thematic undercurrent, running through it? So I think it's a very rich situation to mine, as writers. I think we're constantly asking ourselves this, whether we're even aware of it or not.
Mhm.
My voice just got froggy. Sorry.
Well, and I think it's it's a really interesting thing, like all the pieces of yourself that have to come into play. And like you said, you're the final arbiter of what goes in that book and what's meaningful to say. And so, that part of the revision process of like finding your own voice and being comfortable with your own voice, I think is I think that's what you find in the revision process. What is this story and what does it mean to me and what do I want it to sound like?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Any final thoughts, anyone? All right. Well, that is a great note to end on. So, Dee, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you?
So I have my website, dliebhart.com. It's just my name. And I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram, and my book is available in lots of places. If you look for it, you can get a link on my website as well. And then my literary magazine I was talking about is on Substack. It's called Read. So it's Read Magazine, and we do publish short fiction. So we publish flash fiction and short stories and creative nonfiction. I'm a huge fan of creative nonfiction. So we're running some contests right now. So I'll, hopefully maybe some of your folks will want to enter.
Yeah, definitely. And if you give us a link to read in your contests, we'll put those in the show notes.
That would be great. That would be terrific.
Right. My newsletter, A Room Full of Books and Pencils, is growing every week with new reflections, writing tips, and transcripts of the podcast. It's also where I make announcements about things like upcoming writing workshops and coaching sessions. Check out A Room Full of Books and Pencils at booksandpencils.substack.com. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.